and welcome to Ask a Historian. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. And on this week's episode, we are very pleased to welcome three special guests. Our first segment will feature Mayor Bonnie Crombie and Linden King. Mayor Crombie has been the mayor of Mississauga since her election in 2014. And before that, she served as Ward 5 City Councillor in Mississauga, and before that, Member of Parliament for Mississauga-Streetsville. Prior to entering public life, Mayor Crombie enjoyed a 20-year career in business. Mayor Crombie has worked diligently to lead the growth of the city of Mississauga. It is the 6th largest city in Canada and the 3rd largest in Ontario. Mayor Crombie has an MBA from York University's Schulentz School of Business and earned a corporate director's certificate from the Institute of Corporate Directors at the Rotman School of Management. Joining her will be Linden King. Linden is the chair of Mayor Crombie's Black Caucus, the chair of the United Way for the Greater Toronto Black Community Advisory Council, co-chair for the Region of Peel Police Black Community Advisory Group, and past chair of the Liberty Silver Foundation. He's also a past vice chair of the Congress of Black Women in Mississauga chapter and a stakeholder liaison for the Toronto Caribbean Festival. He has been actively involved with the largest Caribbean festival in North America for over 36 years. Linden also serves on the board of directors of the Mississauga Arts Council and the Canadian Mental Health Association, and he was a volunteer with the Ontario Trillium Foundation Halton Peel Grant Review Team. In addition, Linden has served as a director for the Mississauga Cycling Advisory Committee, the Mississauga Youth Games, and was an advisor for the Peel Multicultural Council. He's also served as a video producer for the Portico Community Church and has coached children in track and field, baseball, and football. Linden was a torchbearer for Toronto's 2015 Pan Am Games, and in 2015 was a recipient of the Gordon S. Shipp Memorial Award as Mississauga's Citizen of the Year. In our last segment today, we'll be welcoming Natasha Henry. Natasha is an educator, historian, author, curriculum consultant who specializes in the development of learning material that focuses on the African diasporic experience. She is also the president of the Ontario Black History Society. Natasha is an author of multiple books and articles, and some of the books include Firsts in 2014, which is awarded the Gold Medal Moonbeam Children's Book Award for Multicultural Nonfiction, as well as Talking About Freedom, Celebrating Freedom in Canada in 2012, and Emancipation Day, Celebrating Freedom in Canada in 2010, amongst, again, many other articles and publications. Natasha has written several entries for the Canadian Encyclopedia on African Canadian history, and Natasha is also a PhD candidate at York University. So we're thrilled to welcome these three individuals this week as we explore our local history and connections to Black History Month. So joining us this week on Ask a Historian, a very big thank you to Mayor Bonnie Crombie and the chair of the Mississauga Black Caucus, Linden King. So thank you for spending some time with us and to explore some of our questions around the creation of Mississauga's Black Caucus. And so we'll jump off right there with our first question, and that really is, why was the Black Caucus formed and why now?
Well, let me kick that off if I can, Matthew, and then I'm sure Linden will have something he'd like to add. But as we all know, 2020 was a very challenging year for so many reasons, not only COVID, but it was also a heartbreaking year, not because of the pandemic, but also because it exposed the numerous racial injustices and inequities that existed not only in the United States, but right here in our own backyard. There has been decades of systemic racism and practices of racial discrimination in our policing, in our justice system, in our healthcare, in our childcare system, and all of this was exposed. And we saw the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and a number of other groups that came together really to protest in our streets, even during the pandemic. And these were demanding change and demanding better for Black lives and for racialized people. And so we thought it was imperative that we did something. Something had to be done, and it had to be something meaningful, something that could bring about the right change, and bring about change is key. And it was incumbent on me as mayor of Mississauga the sixth largest city in Canada, the third largest in Ontario, Toronto, Ottawa, and then us, to stand up and to call for action. And so we did so, particularly on police reform and SIU reform. I had an ally in the Mayor of Brampton, Patrick Brown. We both sit on the police board, and we put forward motions on reforming police, changes to SIU, and changes to the Mental Health Act. At Mississauga Council, we passed a very powerful and meaningful motion called Resolution 207, which formally recognizes discrimination and racism in our society, and in particular in our institutions, as a public health care crisis that leads to issues of precarious employment and unemployment, higher risks of poverty and homelessness, negative experiences within the education sector, health inequities, greater interaction with law enforcement, and overrepresentation in the criminal justice system, mental health, and the child welfare systems. So much was broken. And the developing and creating of the Black Caucus was one of the recommendations in the Resolution 207. Along with a number of other measures that the city manager, Paul Mitchell, and I both pledged to undertake. And the Black Caucus acts as an advisory group to me. And my work in addressing these issues, especially the issues of racism, but in particular anti-Black racism, discrimination, and other initiatives that would help bring about systemic change at the city and right across, not only at City Hall, but across the city of Mississauga, across the region, etc. We hope that it would be a catalyst for change. And we interviewed, the councillors all gave recommendations for members of the Black Caucus, and we picked 12 incredible people. They're just amazing and so knowledgeable, smart, experienced members of the Black community, which is very diverse in itself. So there's Black African, Black Caribbean, etc. And so we try to ensure that they are a microcosm of the different Black communities that exist. And they're led by, of course, Linden King, who's pretty incredible. Linden and I have known each other many years, and he's our chair of the caucus. And we held our inaugural meeting in December, and we've had one meeting since in January. And the members will serve for a term of 1 year, at which point we'll reassess our work plan, and those that feel they have done, their work is completed, will have the ability to jump off at that point, and we can recruit new members, or perhaps they want to stay on, and it's an opportunity to change up the membership and the composition if needed. So that's why it was formed, that's how it was formed. And Linden, why don't you make a few comments on how you see it and why it was formed, and why you agreed to chair it.
And thank you, Bonnie. And first of all, I just want to thank you and council for putting together this well-needed caucus. It's very important that we have this conversation today because we're the International Decade of People of African Descent. In addition to the fact that we've seen a lot of tragic events unfold within around the world, and issues of institutionalized systems and racism has now come to the forefront, and it's important that we have this honest and open dialogue. I also want to highlight the fact that the mayor did mention that she has put together a diverse group of team that's made up of people in the community with lived experience. And we did have 2 meetings so far, and those meetings have been very informative. And it looks like we're going to be making some changes, and we're going to be very impactful with regards to what it is we're seeing with regards to change around anti-Black racism. So thank you.
Well, I'm excited by this. It feels like it's a conversation from my perspective in the years that I've been involved in the heritage aspect of our city, a conversation that we've been kind of fits and starts and trying to get from an information perspective, from a past knowledge perspective of previous generations of people, that it always seems to kind of peter out and hit dead ends in a way, and trying to bridge those gaps between yesterday and today, and having people with, say, ancestors to talk about their past and how it connects to the story of our city. I think that's an important initiative from our perspective to see how the work of the awareness part of the Black Caucus plays out within the city itself. I'm looking forward to that as a conversation to see how it evolves. I know I've hit my head many times over the years trying to do research into our past citizens, where in some cases our past Black citizens 50, 100 years ago are names on a paper, and that is it. And we struggle to find more about them. Who were they? What were their lives, etc. And so they're always a challenge with that. So I'm very excited with that conversation. But in regards to the conversation, how does the Black Caucus itself, what's the intention behind it in terms of working with the community partners? You know, it's a two-part, you know, in part to support the work of those that engage with the public, the museums and heritage organizations, but a second follow-up question later on will be, how do we support the work of the Black Caucus as well? So
Right.
what are those interplays? What's the role of the Black Caucus in that?
So I'll respond to how we're interacting with the community partners and supporting arts, culture, and heritage programming, and maybe Linden can speak to, you know, the work with museums and other community heritage organizations. So there will be conversations occurring, as you so aptly recognized. We'll be working with the Black Caucus to develop the Black Community Consultation Plan, and we're going to be rolling that out this spring, and we'll be hiring a consultant to assist us to do it. And the plan for the consultation will be to draw in our community partners, the members and advocates, to speak about the various subjects and initiatives in order to address anti-Black racism. And one of the focuses on consultations will be on the positive promotion of Black history and, of course, Black culture, which is, as I mentioned earlier, very diverse. And we know that it is an essential part of Canadian history and that has long been forgotten or dismissed or disguised in American Black history. So it's time to recognize it for what it is, a part of our rich history in Canada. And we're committed ways to finding how we can create platforms for the Black community and for every resident, frankly, to have that opportunity to be exposed and exposed to and experience that rich culture and history through cultural and artistic and other various initiatives that will speak to the contribution that Black Canadians have made to the fabric of our community here in Mississauga, in Ontario, and to Canada.
So the other part, and I know I've got a list of questions here as well, but I feel like I've maybe put them out of order, but if I can jump ahead, and how can those same organizations, perhaps Linden, I don't know if you want to jump in, how can we support the work of the Black Caucus? There's a relationship there. It's not only following instruction, but how can we grow and support as well? How do we evolve as organizations to better include that which has been excluded from our story?
I think the key thing here, Matthew, is partnerships. And you need to more or less work with the Black Caucus to understand the communities that are in the Black community, that's the makeup of us, right? And I would strongly advise heritage groups like yours to preserve and collect any artifacts that are relative of their community and their contribution they have made since settling in Canada. This contribute to positive identity and create a sense of belonging in the fabric of the history of our city. I would also like to share the fact that there's an organization by the name of the Congress of Black Women Mississauga chapter. And every Black History Month, what they do is there's a place called Camille's Place, a building that they manage. And they actually decorate the lobby with regards to Black history and identify community leaders within our community. And that's posted up in the lobby. So as you can see, a lot of our community does attend or come to visit people within that building, and they have the opportunity to actually see tangible things that are there in the building. And it's a reflection of us, what it is we're actually doing in the community. And if there's people there that they've not known about, there's a little write-up about them with regards to what it is they're doing in our community. So I think the key thing, I like what it is you're doing in terms of Heritage Mississauga. And I think you guys need to take that extra step and collaborate a bit more with the community with regards to what it is they're doing.
I think, as perhaps, I'll say for myself, but there's other organizations as well. I think a big step would be knowing who to go to and how to make those connections. And I think maybe that's a relationship that can evolve through the Black Caucus to make those bridges.
That's correct. And that's what I was saying. You need to work with the Black Caucus, and we can connect you to those organizations with regards to what it is they're doing, what their strategic directions are, and how they can help you as well.
And vice versa. Maybe then that partnership opens a broader window for them as well, and win-win things, right?
Yeah, correct. Correct.
So just in terms of and maybe you've already in a way answered part of the question, but the work of the Black Caucus of how it can play a role in addressing the gaps that we see, and the narratives of our museums, and we struggle with it, of how to tell that story, past as well, but sometimes there's a break in the timeline when we look at, say 100 years ago to the last 30 years type of thing. But how those breaks in our own stories, in our own collections, in our own narrative that we tell of the city, we recognize that we don't know parts of that story. How can we connect through the Black Caucus? And again, maybe you've already answered it, but help tell that story. Like when we identify there's a gap, how do we best address that gap?
Well, so I can kick that off too, and then Linden, we should also talk about the museums and the other community heritage organizations and the collective stories that they tell and how they preserve history. But with respect to the role of the Black Caucus, well, we rely on them really to share their lived experience, their insights, and to provide direction on what they think is important for the community to see and to hear, and to highlight initiatives and measures that we haven't usually engaged in order for our city to become even more inclusive and even more accessible to each and to everyone, really, not just the Black community, but to everyone.
Yep, and that's well said, Mayor Crombie. Community voice is extremely important because community voice speaks. Community voice are experts of their own local environment, and we identify the community's values, and we create a great awareness about the system. So it is an important role with regards to what the caucus is doing. And it's very important and key that we have individuals on the caucus with that lived experience, and they could bring those lived experience to the board with regards to how we can improve and certain things and areas that we should be looking at and addressing.
I have a kind of a tying question to that in a sense, and I know it's not on our list, but when it comes specific to youth and connecting to young people, a big challenge with cultural groups and museums is often attracting the younger demographic. And we recognize that. That is something that we try to focus a lot of programming on. But when we want to try and connect to not only a younger demographic, but how do we attach to the stories of a much broader cultural base of a younger demographic than we've traditionally had? And so again, does the work of the Black Caucus will be a focus on engaging with youth or maybe establishing ways in which organizations can engage with youth?
Well, I'll start, Linden, and again, certainly it is one demographic we absolutely need to engage. I mean, I'm always looking for ways to engage our youth, whether it's to ensure that we're fostering that unique relationship with them so that we can learn about their life experiences, or that we can ensure that they're engaged in they maintain that they stay in school, within education, whether they're engaged in sports outside within the community. We need to keep our youth engaged, and we need them to plug into our history and the culture, and it's really a sense of passing on traditions. So it's so important we engage them in this exercise so they too can learn about the rich history of the Black community and feel that sense of identity and feel that sense of ownership with it as well.
And Matthew, I'm going to just kind of go back to what the mayor said at the beginning with regards to the composition of the group. It is a diverse group of individuals, and we do have a youth component that is part of the caucus as well. Also, too, I'd just like to mention that we have partnered and we are connected with a number of organizations within the Black community, and they're Black-led organizations that deal primarily with the youth. So we can actually tap into those resources with regards to what the caucus will bring to the table.
It's always most challenging to reach out to the youth, I find.
Yes.
No matter
even
who they are.
Even my own kids.
We're always looking for ways to engage them and to reach out to them and bring them in and ensure that they feel part of belonging, that they feel included, and that they, they want to share, that they become part of our history and our traditions.
Yeah, and I agree completely. The youth is the hardest demographic to crack. How to connect, especially with the way technology evolves. As soon as you master one thing, you're already behind the scenes, sort of thing. What are some of the impacts that you feel that heritage groups might have on our community in the preservation and the sharing of stories of Black Mississaugas? What's the role that we could play collectively as a cultural industry in the preservation of stories or the promotion of stories?
Do you want to take a crack at this, Linden?
Yeah, I think it's essential for museums and community heritage organizations to reflect the communities as that they serve. As you know, Mississauga has a very diverse population, and we have a large Black community as part of that. Therefore, the work and initiatives that are undertaken by our cultural sites and organizations, it needs to speak to the history and the contributions of our community. I'm going to just use an example with regards to the Grange, and that was the legend of Cedar Park. That gave a lot of insight with regards to the Black history in Streetsville and the Ross family at Cedar Park. So a lot of this culture is hidden, and I'm going to have to go back again to the fact that we need to collaborate and we need to build awareness with regards to what is accessible out there. I think we need to foster that dialogue between our residents, and that way it'll create an awareness. And we really want our residents to have a sense of belonging, and they can tangibly point to symbols, exhibits, and initiatives that reflect the history of our heritage. So again, the key word is collaborative, and we have to work with the community so that we can build the awareness.
Several years ago, we had an opportunity to work with Joan Butterfield, the African Canadian Artists Association. I could be wrong with the acronym there at the end. But what amazed me out of that was the sheer number of artists that participated in that art show, which had traveled from Caribana to, I believe it was Scotiabank, downtown to here in Mississauga in a couple of locations. Exceptional art, but a number of Mississauga-born artists were participating in that as an international traveling show, and that was incredible. It was such an eye-opening experience to think that we had that kind of talent. One of them literally lived across the street from the Grange, where our home base. So you just close to home, and here you are in this community working for us with heritage organizations, but having a gallery space, not knowing this previously. It's kind of accidental acquaintances, I guess, in a sense.
Yeah, can I just add to that, Matthew, with regards to what it is you're trying to do? So you mentioned Caribana, which is now Toronto Caribbean Carnival, but Joan Butterfield, excellent artist. I do have her work in my home as well. She actually lived out in Brampton, so she is a resident of Peel. Now, with regards to even stuff like the Toronto Carnival, you have a lot of artists that do costume design, like myself and my kids. We've been doing that for over 30 years.
Oh, wow, Linden, what a skill you have.
Thank you. So what PAMA is doing, and I don't know if we're being recorded, but they're actually connected with the Toronto Carnival, and they're trying to bring a lot of those displays of the arts to that organization so that they could display it. However, we have one jump up on PAMA, and we've already brought Black art to the Mississauga Art Gallery here for the Jamaica 50th. So they're now trying to do that in Brampton with regards to bringing Black art in that. So again, an organization like yourself perhaps maybe should be connecting with those groups so that you can be displaying that type of artwork and getting the history of how that came about, because it's not all about just art. it goes back to slavery, and why all of this came about with regards to how Caravana is actually done on the long weekend in July, or last weekend in July, first weekend in August.
Yeah, so with the Emancipation Day connection.
Correct.
You know, absolutely. And for us, it's not necessarily about bringing art per se into a single organization. It's about, again, for our focus is citywide. And so it's promoting and partnering with the groups that are already making those connections to kind of make it a broader impact on our residents. And I think that's the key, is the partnerships, again, is making the connections and building on relationships. And I think that's what encourages me the most, is knowing that we have a sounding board now, perhaps in the Black Caucus, in that relationship building.
Correct, Matthew. It's right in front of you, the mayor's office. Contact the mayor.
That's right.
I'm not sure she wants us constantly calling.
Oh. Email.
There you go.
So, and we've touched on this a bit, and you've mentioned partnerships considerably, and I think, you know, most important. But what are ways in which you feel we can best support the goals, the endeavors of the Black Caucus, and as they represent people of color and marginalized people within our community? You know, we struggle to make, or not struggle is the wrong word, but we're striving to make those connections and partnerships within our community to tell those stories and collect those stories. But how can we support the work of the Black Caucus?
Well, we thank you for that, because we want you to do just that. We need that shared experience, right? So we need to collect stories, artifacts, art, etc., insights, and help us with this initiative. So either through my office or through Linden and the Black Caucus. And we really want to help raise the profile of Black Mississaugans, Black Canadians, and the contributions that they have made, which are so vast and so deep and so rich. And they should be profiled. And any examples that you can raise and you could share with us, we'll be sure to profile them. And many of the activities we'll be undertaking, and perhaps during next year's Black History Month as well, and help us tell that story, the story of the Caribbean or African Black communities that have come to Mississauga, and what their history is, and where they settled, and what their lived experience has been.
Absolutely.
Yep. Well said, Ms. Crombie, Mayor Crombie.
Linden and I are old friends, so we go back with Bonnie.
Yeah.
We've known each other many years.
Yeah.
I was say, if I can throw it out there, maybe Linden, I can if you could help guide me. I mean, once COVID allows, this is part of the challenge we're all in. You know, we do have an oral history program, and I would be absolutely delighted to sit down and interview, when we're allowed to sit down and do face-to-face interviews, to record more stories than we certainly have on Black Mississaugans and their family, their history, their story of coming to this place, and their impact on this place. You know, those are things I would dearly love to record, and I think that's a window into starting to share the stories, is collecting the stories. And you know, that's something I would really appreciate guidance on and connections with, and really to open up our doors to the collection of those memories. I think that would be a vital link that we could make that would support both what we want to do and what the Black Caucus is trying to do. I think that would be wonderful. Maybe if we can end on one question. This is an open question, and I didn't come up with it myself. I've listened to a lot of lectures the last little while on matters around Black history, and one that keeps coming to mind is, we talk about Black history and Black citizens as a focal point for our discussions. But at what do you foresee a time when it's just history? It's not focused. We're not pulling apart one section to say that we have to focus on this because we've done such a poor job of it. But it's now as part of our story. It's accepted as part of the mainstream story of Mississauga, the identity of Mississauga. Do you see a time? Is this those baby steps to making this part of our story rather than struggling to grasp it?
we would really have succeeded if we can integrate the histories of all of our people, and especially including the Black community, into our own shared history. I think that would be, then we really will feel like a more diverse and inclusive city. And yet we have so many people's stories that we want to integrate and we want to share, but to have the Black story as integral to the Canadian story is just is so vital and so important. And I really think we will have crossed that threshold and achieve what we wanted to have achieved. If they're not separate, but they're one story. They have come together and we share that one story. But I think the unique story is important too. Don't get me wrong. I think we always want to keep track of what the Black history story was and how that contributed and what the contributions were to making our story as Canada and Mississauga so great. But it will be, you know, once they're integrated into one, I think we'll have become successful.
Yeah. Yeah, and Matthew, I think history is history regardless, and history should be celebrated 365 days a year. Black History Month, it is a time to celebrate, but we cannot forget the sacrifices that individuals have made and brought us this far. I think, like we mentioned, we are at a pivotal time. There's a lot more focus with regards to anti-Black racism and what have you, but I still think individuals need to be recognized for their contribution to help to building this community and also this great country as well.
Absolutely, and one of the things that we have identified, and Mayor Crombie, I'm not sure if you know this, you may now, but we spoke to Stephen Dasko about it, Ward 1 Councillor Dasko about it, is we had in the late 1950s into the early 1960s, we had a Black councillor in Lakeview, and one of the earliest in Canada. His name was Victor Vignali, and he was
I didn't know that. I knew about Cliff Giles, but I didn't know.
Yeah, I knew about Cliff as well.
I will fully hat tip to Pama and Nick Moreau at Pama for digging up on this, but we've discovered more about him. He was born in Trinidad and passed away in Jamaica. But for a period of time was a florist in Lakeview and sat on Toronto Township Council, and we found pictures of him. So I mean, we do have these stories to celebrate, and we should celebrate them and make those connections.
Matthew, you just educated me. Sorry.
No kidding. I think we've always felt that if Malton was its own ward, there would be a good chance that there would be another a Black member of our council, because it would be important that that person reflect that community. And of course, there's a high concentration of Black Mississaugans in Malton.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, sharing those stories and celebrating may bring forward more people to be engaged in the civic conversation. And
absolutely.
But thank you for spending the time with us. I really appreciate the time, the energy, the enthusiasm. Linden, you seem to constantly step forward and volunteer to serve on multiple things.
Linden, the Uber volunteer, he's chair of every board on every committee.
Well, thank you.
We got to clone him.
So, I don't know how you do it. I've got a young family, and I volunteer on one committee, and that's about as much time as I've got. So,
right? Yeah. Just so much.
Yeah, thank you.
As one citizen, thank you for your time and your effort and all that you do. And Mayor Crombie, thank you. Your leadership during this unprecedented time is inspiring. As a citizen, I appreciate that, but even as as a historian with Heritage Mississauga, I really look forward to those conversations with the Black Caucus as it evolves and as as those partnerships evolve and those conversations are had. I really look forward to the conversations. So
great.
Thank you so much for spending some time.
Thank you for having us. This is such an important
discussion. This was great.
I'm so glad we had this opportunity. Thank you, Matthew. And thank you, Linden, of course.
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. And thank you, Matthew, as well.
Thank you.
So joining me today with Ask a Historian is Natasha Henry. And Natasha is a person of many hats, historian, author, educator, curriculum consultant for multiple educational systems, boards of education, and president of the Ontario Black History Society. And amongst it all, a PhD candidate at York University. But a tremendous advocate for Black history and for sharing resources relating to Canadian Black history with almost anyone who asks. And so delighted that you had the time to share with us here today and to explore some of the questions we have around the work of the Ontario Black History Society and kind of how we can connect to the broader subject of Black history and Canadian history, with making sure that we continue to have Black history content within, if that's said properly. So just first off, thank you, Natasha. I know you're incredibly busy, so thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. I'm glad to be here with you, Matthew.
Awesome. So just, you are the president of the Ontario Black History Society. I worked with one of your predecessors years ago, Rosemary, but I know that the work has expanded and you do some incredible, there's a video that I encourage everyone to watch on your website called Blacked Out History, powerful, simple statement in terms of how history is taught, how Black history is taught in our society, in our school system. I'm just wondering if you can highlight some of the things that Ontario Black History, the Ontario Black History Society is doing to engage with the community.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm the president of the Ontario Black History Society, and this is my 4th year in this role. And I'm part of just an amazing team of board members and staff who continue to do such amazing work. Even during, the COVID restrictions, we've continued on with some of our programming. This year marks our 43rd year as Historical Society. And, we continue to build on the work of the founders. They started the Ontario Black History Society because they were concerned that their children were not learning enough Black history, Canadian content as well, but also just Black history in general, as well as to raise that public awareness around, Black history and to document Black history as well. One of our first president, Dr. Daniel Hill, was a sociologist, and his research was on Black man's Toronto. There was a sociological study of Black presence in Toronto, and so out of that work, it really was intended, as I said, to raise awareness. And so some of the things they've done included some programming, pushing to have Black History Month officially recognized at the city level, at the provincial level, and at the federal level, to have programming, develop resources, and again, to encourage that conversation. And also as well to continue to provide support and push for inclusion in the curriculum. You mentioned our Blacked Out History video, and with that campaign, it really was intended to reignite the push for more in-depth integration of Black Canadian history in schools generally, and specifically to call for mandated learning expectations in the curriculum, because there isn't one thing that all students in Ontario have to learn about the 400-year Black presence here in Canada. And so we know that this, that impact on Black students, on students of other backgrounds, there's a real impact in terms of missed learning, the perpetuation of misconceptions of people of African descent. And, here we are coming off of a spring and a summer of just tremendous social upheaval, and people calling out for to address anti-Black racism and systemic discrimination. And we recognize, and people recognize, that education plays a crucial role in disrupting some of these views and in really advancing social justice. And so, so this is, our work continues to remain so relevant today. And we are glad to continue to serve in this capacity, and myself as well, to continue to help to lead in this regard.
What are some of the challenges to, I don't know if increasing the awareness, but bringing awareness to our Canadian history in terms of how Black history is connected to the Canadian story, when a lot of the information we have out there tends to be of the American element? How do you juggle that in the guise of your programming? Is it more just awareness of getting the story out there? Or?
So there's several things to that. It's for us, we present the complexities of a Black presence here in Canada that's comprised of numerous waves of migration into Canada, ranging, it could be from forced migration through enslavement, different ways of migration, Black loyalists, freedom seekers, people from the Caribbean, people from, the continent of Africa, and all of that African diaspora is part of the Canadian fabric. And so we do our very best to represent that diversity and that expansiveness of the African diaspora here in Canada. And when we do that, it's often that we will hear that, people will be surprised that there's such a long, extensive history of Black people here in Canada, the French and British colonies, and then the nation of Canada as well. There's often the view that Black people are more recent immigrants to Canada. And something that I always share, but just reflecting on this Black History Month and talking about Black history across Canada, and people are surprised when I show that, Black Canadians live in Yukon, they live in Nunavut, they live in, northern British Columbia, they live, in Newfoundland. Black people, Black Canadians live across Canada, not just in, the largest urban center in Toronto and whatnot. And so we do our best again to capture that and to share that so that people become more informed about the deep history.
What kind of resources does the Ontario Black History Society have that people might be able to consult or engage with or inquire about? What's available for people to interact with?
So, and interact with could be a little bit limiting right now because of but we just recently updated our website. So we have some resources there. We have some profiles on there. We have a great video series that we developed with the Rayla Braithwaite Foundation and Ryerson University, profiling five Black Canadians. We also have, we have a library in our office that's really great, and people can come in. And when we open again, people, when we were open, people could come in and do some researching around our library. We have, and we worked with, I believe it was the Multicultural Historical Society of Ontario, and there's a great set of oral interviews that were done in the 80s. I want to say a number of students, including Lawrence Hill himself, who did some of those oral histories, and they were on the cassettes. Yep. And there's been some work to digitize some of them, and the remainder of the interviews are being digitized, or will continue as time allows. And so these will be available online and more readily accessible. And we have several things as well. We have some artifacts that we share. More recently, we got a few items from the estate of Stanley Grizel, who's a longtime supporter and member. We have just a range of things as well. And so there are those things to share, and we also have our programming. We have a number of items in collections that we want to display, and we continue to push for and work on realizing a museum and archive space, which would allow us to, to take these things out and to share them with the public. But we do have a number of archival artifacts as well.
Wow, it sounds like a brilliant collection, and hopefully it's something that continues to grow. And as we're allowed, people are able to re-engage with, and down the road, maybe even a bigger, more vibrant space to share that. That would be exceptional, and to have the things digitalized today in this day and age as a resource would be phenomenal.
Yes, and that's what we work towards. And I mean, as a charitable organization, you can imagine that the costs involved with some of these things also do cause a bit of an impediment or delay in trying to move as fast as we would like to. But again, we are committed to doing this and to following through on a lot of these goals.
from one not-for-profit to the other, I can commiserate. So it's just, there's a good bridge in our conversation is what can organizations who are focused on history, local heritage and culture, museums at the local level, what can they do to support the work of and the aims of the Ontario Black History Society, but also that aims of just education and knowledge sharing about Black history in our own communities? What kind of things could you see being achievable goals for local organizations?
Well, we always welcome, and we are, strong partners and supporters of other organizations, heritage and history organizations, whether they are Black heritage sites or history sites, or just, history societies. We work to support each other's work and to amplify that work, because we do recognize, that the local histories are so rich and often not well known. And so we support and help to disseminate that information as much as possible. And so one of the things I think of is collaboration and working with each other. I think about, some historical societies, if they have a particular focus, when they're going through their records and they notice, for example, someone is identified as Black or Negro, sharing that information or making an effort to document some of those histories, because while it may be outside of your purview, or it may be, I guess, added work than what they were, planning to focus on, but encountering some of that information and passing it on is really useful. I find that, if you're going through census records or directories and whatnot, and you encounter some of these stories, just being able to spend some time and to uncover those really helps to then expand the stories and understand the experiences of everyday people. And so, those are some of the things that come to mind. I do see that a lot of organizations want to recognize and support, learning about Black history. And so they host their own Black History Month events, or they invite speakers to come and speak, and that is great. And I would like to see that all throughout the year, at different, not just limited to one speaker in February. We can talk about, local history in May or June, and because this is what, we're just passionate about these stories. So we can talk about that, we can talk about it all anytime. So that's another thing.
I was going to say, allow me to be the first then. I'll have you back in May and we'll just talk history.
Yes.
I do find that for myself it is great to have a focus point where a lot of people are focused, and it gives you an audience looking for information that you can share at a particular month. So I'm a big supporter of Black History Month, but I do agree with you. I think we need to be able to integrate that into our regular conversations of history all the time. And part of the challenge is when you probably know this firsthand as well, when you're doing local history, you're trying to tie in those local resources and local stories, sometimes you struggle in finding and connecting to those stories just from a lack of information. You had a phrase I mentioned was patterns of erasure and exclusion. And quite often, as you said, you go back to primary resources, but often we're reliant on others' interpretations of history as we come forward in time. And so when you're dealing with kind of generations of not talking about the story, you lose an opportunity, in a sense, to engage with that story in a rich sense. And so you're kind of back to, you're almost scrambling back 2 or 3 generations previous to find information that normally you might have lots of around another family, and it's a challenge.
Yes, and that happens. So going back to my example of this, the census or directories or whatnot, and how and it's not a blame game. People just have their focus and their interest, but people will go and look for particular families or communities, religious groups, ethnic groups, racial groups, and then So there's that focus on that particular group, but yet and still you're encountering and going through those records, you're encountering so many different, people of different backgrounds. And so that selection process of what gets carried forward as the history, as the local history, and what gets left behind, right?
Yeah.
And contributes to that process. And so that selection process is oftentimes, it contributes to the lack of awareness and somewhat the lack of documentation of Black history. So sometimes people think, oh, well, there weren't a lot of Black people here, or there aren't a lot of records. How will we know? But if you go into some of these records, one of the things that I mentioned to you, you can see how, for example, people are identified as Negro or Black or African or mulatto. A lot of those phrases are indicators of a Black presence. And for me, those are just gems to be able to identify people and to further then track some of their, their whereabouts and their stories and their lives and try to put things together. And so oftentimes, because we are, Canada as a white dominant society, and looking at what, if they want to phrase it as the two founding nations, is problematic, right? The French and English, or there's a focus on, European immigration, then the stories of, of Black Canadians or African Americans who immigrated to Canada, those stories don't become part of those central narratives.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of the work that I do, other researchers do for Black history, is try to recover some of those stories that are there.
One thing you mentioned in one of your previous presentations was one of your own focal points was to develop a database of the enslaved with connections to Ontario. And I think it sounds brilliant. I can't imagine the amount of work that must go into trying to do that. But I think that highlights something that I wanted to reference was a lot of people, particularly when we're talking about Black history, they look at our society, our history, as being one of, that slavery did not occur here. Canada was the place of freedom. And we know that's not true. We know that there is this story here, but often it's very difficult to connect with it. And so I don't know that I have a perfect question in there, but it's like this idea of the story of Black history is much more nuanced, much more layered, much older than people realize, and trying to connect with that must be a challenge. You must have the same introduction conversation quite a bit.
It is such a challenge, and again, we have to recognize when we look at the archives and the role of the colonial archives and whose records were deemed to be valued to keep and to store and to pass on to maintain for posterity. So there's the record keeping, but then it's how do Black people show up in the archives? And when you talk about history of enslavement, that means then that Black people were not showing up as humans or as people who were owned and produced the records. They were showing up as chattel property, as property, of loyalists, of white settlers. And so that has led me to go into these personal records, these colonial archives. None of our archives have collections or funds specific to enslavement, for example. So it requires, using these secondary sources and then trying to trace back to some primary sources and some personal records and going through those, and whether these are ledgers or wills or church records are quite useful, and looking for and uncovering. And it does take an exceptional amount of work in order to do that. But it's something that I am determined to do as much as I can. And now that I've wrapped my head around what it looks like in a sense, and so it doesn't seem, it is daunting, but it doesn't seem as daunting because I recognize now, at least a way to try to locate those who were enslaved in the archives. And so then the database then is a response to that and a redress to say that there needs to be and there should be an archive dedicated to these particular group of people for us to better understand and appreciate their historical experiences as well. And so it's a corrective to, a disruption to the colonial archives and how they show up there.
how is I mean, this project, by the sounds of it, I'm guessing is still in its infancy and probably a long way, still a lot of work to do. But how has the response been from the informational repositories that these colonial archives that have this information to the idea of expanding their own narratives in terms of the records that they have and how they shed light on this part of our history?
The archives have been responsive and supportive of my, of my personal research, and I would like to see, as my research comes into, at least this first stage of it comes into completion, more conversations around the archives. But we know that more broadly speaking, that archives are having their own reckoning in terms of, being colonial institutions. So whether it's in regards to Indigenous histories or, other lesser known histories, that they are doing work in order to be, to correct that, calling out for collections for from people of different communities, for example, working with communities to collect and preserve, historical documents. And so it's a good time for that to take place. And so they're more receptive. There's a reception, a positive reception to looking at the history of enslavement. The church records as well have been a wealth of information for documenting those who were enslaved. And so I've had to take a number of trips to different archives in order to, to look at some of these records. And again, I've received a lot of support and assistance from these archives. And so I think I would like my work to further that conversation and to get archives to take a look at their ongoing rethinking of taxonomy and categorization, and think about how particular groups show up and don't show up, and work to kind of improve that and make them more visible.
I look forward to that conversation taking place and being part of a conversation, because I can see that as something that lacks in our own records locally, and something we would definitely like to broaden the conversation on.
Yeah, just quickly, because I think I just wanted to say something before you continue, because I think sometimes people will say, or it could be, for example, a white person in these smaller historical societies will think, well, I don't want to identify or say that person was Black or that they were Negro. They were just people, right? They were just part of the community. And what I'm saying is that it's good to use those labels to identify who people were, so we can better understand those experiences, recognizing that race is not the sole experience, but it has shaped the experience of Canadians. And so you can use that, and you can say, like, oh, there was a family here, there was a Black family who lived on this street, and they were here for 10 years. And it's okay to do that. It's good to do that, to recognize again and to make visible those stories, as opposed to just having this lens of this color neutral lens.
I wonder if long term, maybe people beyond us, but at some point, if you feel that it's been successful and you've integrated the idea of Black history as part of Canadian history, and we start talking about Canadian history as a whole, with certain focus points on every group that has part of the Canadian story, maybe that's the point where we can say we feel safe about dropping the monikers. But the labels are important.
Yes, they are. They're important tools for identifying people. And we can talk about, we're speaking, specifically here about Black history, but how do we identify women? How do we identify, Indigenous people, people of other racial, religious backgrounds, and help us to better understand again those experiences.
I think you hit it on the nail on the head. Really, for me, is that it is a colonial archive. It's a colonial history that has largely been written and recorded by multiple generations before us. I look at myself, I'm a white Anglo-Saxon male. I'm about as privileged as I'm going to be in my society. And many of the hardships that others have faced, I've read about and I've talked about, but I've not personally gone through myself. And I'm cognizant of that. But when you look back in time and you try to piece together stories of these families, you deal with, marginalized people within marginalized people, historically speaking. So when you try to capture the story of a woman who is Black in a colonial society 120 years ago, I mean, good luck on you. Like, honestly, from a record perspective, it's
exactly, yes.
do you think, maybe this answers itself as a question, but we deal with these generations of exclusion and erasure, as you put it, in these patterns of it, that the story that's told over and over again throughout our history is largely from the colonial perspective, the white colonial perspective in Canada, where we struggle today to try and connect with the rising generation. Young people are always a struggle of trying to connect with them, make them interested in their history, make them willing to share their stories and their history, particularly new immigrants. With this idea, has it been self-defeating in the sense that we're trying to correct the story so we can connect to the modern generation because we don't have their stories either? Is that kind of, do you know what I'm meaning by that? Like, is this something that is a two-pronged approach in a sense? Because I feel like I'm grasping on two ends. You know what I mean?
Yes, and so how does this work continue? How do we ignite this interest that we have, right, in this seemingly mundane history and these old records? How do we ignite young people's interest so that that work continues? But young people have so many questions. And I think, the approach to how you bring them into these stories, how you connect with them, why is the past relevant to the present? How does the past help to illuminate the present, right? Those things are important. And I think when it's done in a way that you can make that connection, a spark is lit. And I've seen that many times, which is why, for me, some of the work that I do around curriculum is because of that.
Well, and I think that's perfect tie into what we talked at the beginning. I can see how integral the work of the Ontario Black History Society and you yourself are to that movement of igniting interest and igniting the passions of it. And I wish you all the best moving forward, and add the juggle.
It's glad to speak with you. I know that, in a similar boat, in the sense that, we're so passionate and, about the history, and doing a lot of that, that research and uncovering this history, and sometimes going in a rabbit hole, trying to find more information. And so, I really enjoy having conversations with people who understand that.
Well, I appreciate your time, and I thank you for your passion and your guidance and your leadership in this. It's amazing to have somebody who is this passionate and this willing to share. And forgive me if I'm wrong. You're also a Mississauga citizen, so we can call you ours too. So.
Yes, I am.
And I do mean that. In May or April or whatever, we'll come back on and we'll just talk history and talk some of the families we've researched and some of the important milestones. I'd love that dearly, and anything that we can do to share the conversation and share a story and make sure we have the conversation as important as it is during Black History Month, but beyond Black History Month as well.
Yes, will do. Yes, looking forward.
So Natasha, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
You're welcome, Matthew. Take care.
Thank you for joining us this week on Ask a Historian as we explored and connected with some of the stories related to Black History Month and how it connects to our story here in Mississauga and in Canada. It is our great pleasure to have welcomed Her Worship Mayor Bonnie Crombie, Linden King, the chair of the Mayor's Black Caucus, and Natasha Henry, the president of the Ontario Black History Society, for spending some time with us this week on our episode here at Ask a Historian. We look forward to continuing conversations with you in future episodes. Thank you.